Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast, Industry Matters Respiratory Edition. I'm Boone Lockard, VP of Clinical Services here at VGM, and today we have some industry experts to talk about the proposed NCD for RAD devices and HMV in the market. So I will kick it off over here to Rhonda for an introduction, and then we'll move on to Zach and Ray.
Good morning, everyone. This is Rhonda with VGM, the Senior Director of Payer Relations and Reimbursement.
Hello, everybody. Zach Gantt, CEO of Encore Healthcare.
And I'm Ray Gregg, VP of Sales and Business Development with Encore Healthcare.
Well, thanks, everyone. We wanted to gather a smaller group of us industry experts. I won't consider myself an industry expert, but definitely have them on the call here today. Really wanted to do a deep dive into the RAD and HMV NCD. So let's kick this off. Ray, Zach, Rhonda, really, why are we here today? Why'd we join forces here?
Well, Rhonda, you could take us through kind of how we got to this point and a little bit of history, because I know from my standpoint, when I got into non-invasive ventilation in 2010, back way before the industry had kind of jumped in, we knew this day was coming, and we've been waiting on this day. Actually, I assumed this day would come a lot sooner than it did. And so here we are. Could you give us a little bit of background on how we got here, and then we can maybe jump into the actual NCD?
Yeah. So, as the ventilator category, the ventilator treatments have increased, it's been very vague with policy requirements. We've had an NCD, but it's basically about diagnoses. There's some language you can look at in the program integrity manual as far as documentation needs for medical necessity, and that's for any DME item. But the industry really wanted a policy, an LCD. And so the push, like you said, Zach, has been for years to get some more detailed coverage. And within the last few years, that's the conversation started picking up. And then finally last fall is when we saw the first comments about NCD coming out. And it was pretty interesting how that was released, because it was a PDF just from a bunch of different industry groups like CHEST, ATS, I think ARC, ASM. There was just different groups that got involved, and CMS had asked the industry for comments. That was last fall, and then here we are today in March, when this more not finalized, but more detailed, coverage criteria has been released, and it's specific to COPD patients, not at the neuromuscular or any other restrictive disease type patients, but COPD. And so this is where we are. So the industry asked for a policy, and now we're like, uh-oh, look what's in it. And so there's some good and some bad with it. I think it's mostly on the concerning side. So that's how we got here. And one last thing before I pass this on is this is so important for everybody to read and digest and comment, because comments are due April 10th, and they need to hear the comments. They need to hear them, whether you like the policy or if you don't like the policy and what you don't like about it, they need to hear them. So this is our chance, right? So do you want to talk a little bit more about it, Zach, about what's in there and concerning maybe?
Just to that point, Rhonda, they need to hear our comments. What kind of comments do they need to hear about what it means for the patient, what it's going to mean for the industry? I mean, what kind of comments are going to be effective in this process? Because I assume a comment of, I don't like this is probably not very effective, right? But a comment of, I don't like this because it's going to be detrimental to my patients, and here's why, is going to be a lot more effective, right?
Correct. Absolutely. You have to. So they always look at the proof is in the pudding, right? So they do their research, and the research that is tied to this particular release, this proposal is questionable because it's older and its technology has changed, and it's concerning because some suppliers have said, well, this is studies from Europe. We don't live in Europe. That those kind of conversations have come up with me. But yes, you have to explain the why, not just I don't like it. They will just move on from that. They won't take that into consideration at all. So look at your patients, even talk to referrals and say this is what they could be coming out with, and talk to them to see how you can justify. Maybe you don't like the blood gas study that's tied to it, or compliance, whatever it is. Just you got to explain the why. Good point.
So as we get into kind of looking at this and digesting it, our thought process here is we're going to have this podcast today and then another one very soon that'll get more into the clinical side of what does this mean for patients and providers. But today we wanted to really kind of digest what does it say and what are the big key points. And so just to summarize from an industry standpoint, it's going to make it easier for a patient to go to a RAD device, which is something we have been complaining about as an industry for a long time, is that it's too hard to put somebody on RAD. It's always been easier to put them on ventilation than RAD. So that part of the message got heard. And so it's going to be easier to put somebody on a RAD device. It'll be harder to keep somebody on a RAD device because now there's a follow-up period that has to happen every 6 months to confirm the patient's using it and continuing to progress. So it's going to be easier to get on a RAD, harder to stay on a RAD. Also, there's some restrictive language in there around a RAD device, things like high pressures, which we'll get into in a minute, but there are some things that are kind of restrictive and did come from those European studies. I'll just say, obviously, Europeans' lungs are the same as ours, right? But the system of how those were done and the timing of when those were done and the technology that existed at the time are different. And so if you're looking at studies from the 90s, which a lot of these studies are, they are very outdated. And I think that's one of the complaints the industry has, is that ventilation has evolved a lot since then. And so to look at those studies seems a little bit crazy. So it's easier to get on RAD. It's a little bit easier to get on RAD with a backup rate. And then it's harder to get onto ventilation. And there's kind of clear pathways to get to ventilation that are a little bit more restrictive, but maybe there's not as clear of a pathway of some of the transitions of how do you go from RAD to ventilation and some of those things that we really would like to know as an industry. So just to kind of summarize, as Rhonda said, we asked for this, and oftentimes you ask for something like this because we asked for it for good reason, right? We wanted to be clear. We didn't want to be in trouble in audits. We didn't want to get in a position where it's so gray that nobody really knows what to do. And so the industry said, hey, we need a coverage determination. And oftentimes when we ask for these things, this is what happens, right? We get one, but it doesn't land where we thought it would or where we hoped it would. And so we get in a position where now, what does that mean for our industry? But also more importantly, what does that mean for patients? If you think about all the patients that are out there who today are receiving ventilation, what's it mean for them? And what's it mean for the future patient who needs ventilation and may have a harder time getting it, or providers may be more reluctant to write the order for it. So I think those are some of the things that we really need to address in the comments and in some of these discussions. So Ray, Boone, I've talked a lot here. What do you guys, when we start to go through this policy, is there any call outs that you see that are going to be really challenging?
Yeah, no, thanks, Boone. I think when I look at it, just, my first time reading through the policy, and again, to Zach's point, you definitely want to take the time to kind of read through this. The first 4 to 5 pages are the actual policy, and then the other, 50 plus pages is kind of the supporting documentation, foundational documentation of how they came about with these policies. So the first 4 to 5 pages is actually the new guidelines. What really stood out to me is one, they are definitely putting a firm line in the sand around a CO2 level. So they're saying whether it's a RAD or whether it's what they're calling an HMV, what we in the industry commonly call NIV, but that home mechanical ventilator. So whether it's a RAD or it's a home life support vent, they're saying that patient has to be hypercapnic respiratory failure, and they have to be at a PA CO2 of 52 or greater. So, I know we have some partners in the industry, some HMEs in the industry that will take a lower level of hypercapnia. We all know, we're all therapists on this call, that technically hypercapnia is anything above 45. There's a lot of HMEs that will take a lower level of CO2 currently, or they will maybe in lieu of a CO2, they may also take a PFT if there's not a CO2, a more recent CO2 reading. So this is saying that that patient's going to have an ABG, and it's going to have to be at 52 or greater in order to qualify for either RAD or for HMV. So I think that's something to really think about if you're a current provider of NIV. it'd be worth taking the time to look at your current patient base to get an idea of what percentage of my current patient base would meet this new policy criteria of 52 or greater based off of an ABG blood gas value.
Mm-hmm.
And the part that really caught my eye was the whole thing did, but around the compliance section, what's considered compliant? They listed in here that a patient needs to use the device for at least 5 hours on a consistent basis. From my perspective, that really leaves us open to interpretation issues, whether that's interpreting that consistency from the physician level, from the DME perspective, or a contract auditor that's sitting in your office. So that is very concerning to me outside of some other stuff that we'll talk about. But that's my take on the compliance piece of it.
I was just going to add to Ray's comment about the ABG even. There's with the NCD that we currently have, there is flexibility to qualify someone for a ventilator, right? You technically don't need an ABG. Is it good? Of course, it's good to have. We've kind of made a stance in our industry saying we need it, but according to the current language that's out there, we don't. Now we have to have an ABG. With that being said, there are other payers that have incorporated in their language a VBG is allowed, the venous blood gas. Not in this policy, not in title, it's an ABG. So that to me is an access issue for some patients because they would have to go now into a hospital lab or somewhere to get qualified if they're not trying to get qualified within the hospital setting. So just kind of keep that in mind too when you're looking at these comments for the ventilator.
Yeah, and I think to that point, transcutaneous as well as in title has become a standard, and less patients get blood gases. And I know that's the gold standard, and we all would love to go with the gold standard. But like you said, access to care to be able to do that, it's really hard these days. 10 years ago, it was every patient had a blood gas. These days, not many patients have blood gases. And so oftentimes what we're seeing is patients come out of the hospital and they may not even have done a blood gas in the hospital. And so now we don't have a way to qualify them, even though we know that they need ventilation. So I think there's already an access to care issue with blood gases. This is going to create an even bigger one because not only do you have to do it up front, but you have to continue to confirm that they need it. And that's not real clear on what that looks like. And so the idea of, okay, maybe even having a blood gas up front is one thing, but when you're continuing to confirm that this is working, we definitely, I feel like, need to have the ability to do transcutaneous in title. And, if somebody's on their therapy, probably transcutaneous is better than in title, right? Because in title is going to be hard to do while you're on non-invasive ventilation. But either way, those are widely accepted ways to trend data, maybe not to diagnose, but to trend data. And so if we're talking about a trend of is this patient continuing to do better, then it just seems logical that in this day and age that we're in where everything's non-invasive, why are we going back to requiring something that's so invasive and so hard to go get done on an outpatient basis?
It's not always easy to do those blood gases. I can remember some of those frail patients that it's hard to get a blood gas on, right? So, and you have to, it's a challenge.
And I would say, we were hopeful in the fall when the comments were asked for before, when there was verbiage about transcutaneous and end tidal. And then we see this here a week ago, and it's like it just got completely thrown out the window.
Agreed. So can we go back to the compliance thing for a second? Because Boone, you brought up a really good point, that 5 hours. And so the way that reads is it says consistent use of the device for an average of at least 5 hours per 24-hour period. Now, to me, that seems a little bit confusing, right? Because number one, when we think about ventilation for a patient who has chronic respiratory failure, first of all, who came up with the idea that you got to use it every single day, right? Because you have these peaks and valleys with exacerbations and with respiratory failure. And I know patients that have severe respiratory failure and they don't use their device every day because they don't have problems every day. When they're having a good week, they may not use it that much. When they're having a bad week, they might use it 8 hours a day. So, it seems like we kind of pulled a number out of the air based on these studies where the average in these studies that they referenced was about 5 hours or less. And so the idea of saying that like the PAP world, you got to use it every single day or some percentage of days every single day for ventilation and respiratory failure just doesn't seem to make sense. And this has been a soapbox that I've been on, other people have been on, is where did we even come up with this, that you got to use it every single day? I mean, if we're avoiding somebody going to the hospital because they have access to ventilation, and when they have an exacerbation, they have the ability to do it at home versus going to the hospital, then that seems like that should be enough. But I understand we got to have some kind of rule and some kind of guideline to go by. But I guess my question may be for you, Rhonda, because you're the expert on this, is when it says consistent use for an average of 5 hours in a 24-hour period, what does that mean really?
CMS loves to have the waters muddy, right? So when there's an audit from the various contractors that do audits, there's the interpretation piece. But I can tell you the RAD policy has very similar language, not the same, but similar. And they, meaning the contractors in the past, have said consistently is really left up to the physician treating that patient to determine if the patient's using it per their prescription. So from what I've seen, and when suppliers ask me about that as well, I will tell them that the expectation is the patient would wear it on a regular basis. If there's a week or two, that they can't, okay, why? They understand patients get sick, things happen. But if there's months or, there's a long period of time where they're not, is that consistent? No, because they're not. Do they really need it? From what they're looking at, if I could guess, and I don't like to always put myself in their shoes because that's kind of scary sometimes, but they want to have justification for paying for a high dollar item, right? They don't want this high dollar item that they're paying for sitting in the corner collecting dust. So they want to make sure that the patients that have the product and the suppliers that are dispensing the product are making sure the patient's using it. So I get the compliance piece, why they came up with that. I agree with you guys. That's the question of where did this come from? Why did they pull this out of the air? So I agree with that part, but that is what I see as consistent.
So in some ways, saying consistent versus saying this is the exact amount could be better, but then it's also left up to interpretation. So it also could be that it's more restrictive depending on who's doing the audit and the region and all those things. So it kind of leaves things up to interpretation, if you will, in this area, because you could read that to say it has to be an average for the entire month consistently of 5 hours. So, when I first read it, I thought, well, there's no way we're going to do this, because we looked at the 40,000 patients that we had, and we started to look at how many of those patients are over 4 hours, how many of them are over 5 hours, and then how consistent is that? And so the data really doesn't validate that patients are using it consistently more than 5 hours, especially 100% of the time. I mean, that number was very low. But when it comes to over 70%, the number was pretty good at 5 hours. So I think that the challenge being that it's still somewhat vague and somewhat left up for interpretation, which was the whole point of asking for this, was so we didn't have those vague and up for interpretation kind of comments. But to your point, it could be better, because if it says 70% of the days, then you're at 69, you're picking it up.
That's what I was just going to say. So you read my mind. Is it like the CPAP policy where it says it's 70%? Yeah, if you're at 69, 68, the patient's considered failed in that trial period during that 12 weeks. I don't know that we would necessarily want that specific number, because now you have some flexibility. And if you work as a supplier with that physician that's treating the patient, then you can get that documentation to show patient is consistently using it, and they're benefiting from it. And that, to me, you can work through the appeals process and get that overturned. To me, that would be easier versus the hard stop on a number. That's how I see it. And I would hope the industry would see it that way too, that they wouldn't want a hard stop on a number, especially having to monitor that patient every 6 months, right? With a visit, if you have to keep them at that 70%, let's say, as an example, that's tough, I think, right? So
I was just going to say, if they're benefiting from it, like Zach said, I want to say with intermittent use, but more so on that consistent basis, putting a hard stop on it.
I think the other thing we need to talk about is where they came up with the language on the initial coverage for a RAD with backup when it talks about the high intensity mode. So you want to go over that?
Zach had a trigger earlier when he mentioned frail, and that was kind of leading, I feel like, into this high intensity piece of the conversation.
Yeah, I think the challenge with, I mentioned some of the studies from the 90s. There's also some studies from, 2010, 2014 kind of range. And a lot of those studies were looking at high pressure, high intensity BiPAP, right? So it was not looking at ventilators today, non-invasive ventilators today, or HMV as they're calling it in this document, but it was really looking at bi-level. And to get the result, essentially you had to be over an IPAP of 20. So that number is in here. And that's a really challenging number for a couple of reasons. One is because, well, we do have volume targeted modes on some of the PAP devices, right? The RAD devices. There's no call out for that at all. So if we're saying the document says you have to be over 20 on an IPAP, high intensity, then essentially what that means is that you're not doing any kind of volume guarantee mode based on the way this reads, but also that you have to have a patient at very high intensity, which not a lot of patients tolerate. And so I think the challenging part of that is if they don't tolerate, then it also doesn't really lead you to a crosswalk, in my opinion, of what do you do when they're frail, they can't tolerate pressures of 20. I mean, some patients will tolerate it fine, but others, that's going to be very intense, especially if you don't have those extra features, right? If you could set a min and max and have a volume guarantee in that, then of course over 20 would be fine because it would fluctuate for comfort. But if you're setting a hard number over 20, then that's going to be uncomfortable for a lot of patients. And Ray, I know you mentioned as we were talking the other day, some of the studies that this came from and some of the data from that. So you want to talk on that at all?
Yeah, no, thanks, Zach. So to your point, you're right. I mean, this proposed memo is very specific. They mention it in the opening paragraph of the RAD section, and then the very last section in the RAD section before they go to H&B coverage, they reiterate what they said in the first paragraph, that the RAD is to be used in a high intensity mode, meaning greater than 20 centimeters of IPAP, with a backup rate that's at least at 14. So to Zach's point, in a couple of these kind of more recent clinical studies that were done in Europe, one was like 2014, the other was 2017, where they showed really good reduction in CO2 and that seemed to result in an improvement in mortality in these patients. They really ventilated these patients. I mean, they put them on really high IPAPs with relatively low EPAP. So you had a really big pressure support on every breath was the point, to really flush the lung. And then they put them on a really high backup rate of at least 14 to 16. So, what happens when we go to sleep? Everyone, even folks with, compromised lungs, your respiratory rate slows down a little bit. But in this case, they're getting ventilated. They're getting a big breath, every breath, and a high backup rate. So my concern would be, I think, the potential there is you're going to see folks that have a lot of tolerance issue or potentially have some tolerance issues. And you're right. They propose in this memo that if there's an issue with the patient being on that high intensity mode, you can go to a non-backup rate bi-level and basically just turn the rate off. But you're still going to have the huge pressure support delta that they're having to breathe on. So it honestly doesn't make a lot of clinical sense, at least in my opinion, to do that. So it doesn't really fully address the issue. And then as a provider, hey, we've got a patient who's really struggling on this bi-level ST device because of these settings. So now we're going to have to put them on a less expensive device. We're going to have to put them on a bi-level without a backup rate as the solution, when potentially it's a combination of the rate and the big pressure they're breathing on that's causing the discomfort. So that there's not really, as Ronda was saying earlier, they've not really laid out a pathway for someone who's non-tolerant to get over to HMD, where we might have more flexibility of settings in this document.
And I think one of the other things that's important to talk about in the RAD section of this is, so you've got a little bit easier to get to a RAD, but you need to be on high pressures, right? So that's high intensity ventilation. But then the other part of that is there's kind of a different pathway, a little bit different pathway if you're coming out of the hospital, which I think is really good, because the challenge in the past is only one pathway. It really wasn't one size fits all, because we all saw situations where people needed devices and we couldn't get it for them. And so I love the idea of having a separate pathway coming out of the hospital, and really making it somewhat easier to do, I would think, a little bit, but also creates some new challenges. And that new challenge is that they have to be on the same rad therapy in the hospital, and they have to be on within a 24-hour period. And so I think where that brings in challenges is we don't know sometimes what a hospital is doing, right? A hospital may have visions that are 30 years old and don't have volume guarantee. They might have, old bypass they're using. I mean, I remember when I was in the hospital, we were still using the old bypass from Philips that were 30 years old at that time. Now they're in our museum out here. And so the thought that whatever they're using in the hospital has to be transitioned home as far as the therapy modes also makes it challenging, not as much on the rad side, but when you get to the ventilation side, it's going to make it a little bit challenging. So there is a requirement there that they have to be on within 24 hours. Now, if you think about when a patient is being discharged from the hospital, the physician's mindset is not wean them off the device and they'll never need it again. The physician's mindset is, I need to get them stable enough that I can send them home without them crashing, right? So getting them off the device for a while before they go home is not that they're never going to need it again. It's more so, how do I keep them from crashing in that 10-hour period? Or what if the DME doesn't come till the next day? Are they going to be stable enough to make it until they get there? So I think the challenge being that 24-hour period, again, may not be as big of a challenge on the rad side. On the ventilation side, we'll see. But I think that depending on how restrictive that is, it could become a challenge in the transition. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Think of, and we agree, right? Like it is a concern and unclear to that point, right? It's a concern and unclear. So.
Yeah, I mean, and again, just thinking about how patients are treated in the acute care environment versus the home care, again, to be able to go home on HMV straight out of the hospital, to your point, Zach, then they have to be on a HMV within 24 hours of discharge in the hospital. And how many hospitals use a life support device on the general floor, particularly on a patient who's trending well enough to go home? Most of those folks, if they're placed on some sort of therapy, it's probably high flow, or like you said, Zach, maybe a RAD, for nocturnal use or something. So, is the hospital going to change some of their protocol to where they'll put them on an HMV within 24 hours of discharge? Usually it is lower acuity levels of therapy as they get closer to transition home. So it remains to be seen.
I feel like there's a lot to learn on the home care side for us with the new proposal, but then it's also articulating that to your referral sources and the physicians to make sure that we're covering ourselves for qualification.
It almost feels like some of the decisions that they made in this proposal were from at a vision of an acute side versus post-acute, right? So we got to, let's look at the home care side of it, getting the patients, to transition into home and still be able to take care of themselves and have the proper equipment versus that acute side. Yeah, that's how I see it. It's more acute based.
Well, I think one of the complaints I've always had is that they bring in, to do these policies, oftentimes they bring in some of the most brilliant minds in acute care, right? And know a lot of the docs that were part of the committees that did the groundwork, the foundational work for this. And they're some of the most brilliant minds in acute care. My challenge has always been, soapbox has always been, why don't we have more people that are in home care at the table? Because I think that is, if you look at this just from a acute care lens, then yes, it makes sense clinically. But if you look at it from logistical and how do we actually manage patients and where does the rubber meet the road, there's a bunch of challenges with it. And I think that is the inherent problem is that we didn't have home care people at the table in some of these conversations to be able to say, look, that makes sense for you. Doesn't make sense on this side, and here's why. And here's where the challenge is going to be, and here's the things that we can't really control that are going to affect patient care.
I think the other thing, one of the other big things, potential changes if this goes through, is whether we're talking about a RAD or whether we're talking about an HMV, that patient has to be reevaluated by the doctor at least every 6 months, every 180 days, as it states in there, in order to continue coverage of that device. So obviously with the RAD being a capped item, you've got 13 months, right? So in that case, if you're trying to maximize that full 13 months billing, if you get it approved, you're good for the first 6, but then that patient's going to have to be back in there having a reevaluation by the doctor before that 6 months window is up in order to get re-up for the next 6 months. And then you're going to have one more of those reevaluations by the doc if you're trying to capture that final 13th month of billing. And then on the side, your HMV side, you're just going to have to make sure, that patient's got to be in that doctor's office at least every 6 months, for kind of a research or re-auth, from the physician. And again, that's good clinical practice. These folks should be managed. The idea of the patient seeing the doc at least twice a year makes a lot of sense. But we also know with a lot of these patients, there's gaps in care. Some of them maybe don't see a pulmonologist either at all or even on a semi-regular basis, or they're trying to be managed by their PCP. And so I just think it starts to put a lot of onus on the HME that they need to have a system or platform or some way that they can kind of stay connected to that patient in order to help to make sure that that patient is having some sort of regular visit, with their physician and their care team. I don't know, Zach, if you've got any comments on that.
Yeah, I think it's going to change up the industry in a couple of ways, right? Because historically, RAD has been treated a lot like the PAP side because that's the category it's in, whereas we're looking at compliance, 90-day compliance, and there's not an RT in the home. And I think the big call out for me on this whole thing is that when you make it easier for a RAD, which I believe we should have done, and I like that we did that. But the thing that nobody's really talking about, and they did talk about it in some of the earlier documents, like Boone said, was that if you are frequently serviced under ventilation, you have an RT who's coming in the home, who's doing regular follow-ups, who's managing symptoms and care. And so you have an RT involved in the care. Well, on the RAD side, the reimbursement's just not there. And so the setup's done by an RT in most states, some states maybe even not because it's not a law. Most states it's done by an RT. And then from that point forward, there's always been minimal follow-up. Well, that can't be the case anymore. And I think that's where, when you think about where RAD goes in the future, there's already not a huge margin on that side of the business to be able to provide care. But if you don't provide care, then you're going to miss these follow-ups. And if you don't have a way to track and have a way to manage that patient and show progression that they're doing better or those types of things, then you're going to lose coverage on that. So it really does change the game, both on a RAD and HMV side of how we do follow-ups, and we have to confirm appointments. And, it's as Ray said, it's kind of up to us as providers to start coordinating that, because if we don't, then payment goes away. And so the challenge of that. Now, the flip side is obviously there's resupply on the RAD side, which you don't have with ventilation today, but it definitely becomes more challenging, and it changes the game for how we need to manage patients on RAD to see if they fail RAD, but also just to clinically manage them to be able to track these 6-month follow-ups and are they progressing.
From the world I sit in, that to both of your points is the concern is that, not disrupting the cash flow, right? So continuing on those payments for the supplier, because the patient still has the equipment, patient still needs the equipment, but if the criteria is not met, supplier is going to have to hold up getting paid for that product, right? So there's more involvement on the supplier side with staff, clinicians, whoever that clinician is. The payment hasn't changed, right? Same payment regardless, but there's more involvement on the supplier side, and the supplier will still be looked at as the redheaded stepchild because they're pushing to make sure the patient's following the criteria so they don't have to do other repercussions, maybe, pick up the equipment, which we don't want to do for these types of patients, or transfer the payment over to the patient as a patient pay. We don't want to do that either. So there are some concerns there on the billing reimbursement side of it too, of what that would look like.
And I think to that point we made earlier, this would be a perfect place, the continued use for transcutaneous entitled CO2 to be involved, right? Because it's one or more of the following clinical outcomes achieved. And there are some that we can definitely, we're definitely able to manage, and we're definitely able to prove, reductions in symptoms, that kind of thing. But if transcutaneous or entitled was on there, it would make it a lot easier for us to, I mean, that's the best way to prove, right? You can always say, subjectively we reduce symptoms, but if we had transcutaneous entitled, it would be a really good objective way to say this therapy is working, makes all the sense in the world to keep doing it, right? But we don't have that option. So you either have to get a blood gas or you have to document symptoms reduction, those types of things in the follow-up with the physician. So I think this would be a great place to say, let's use newer age technology to continue confirming that this therapy is working.
Yep, I agree.
So I know we're going to run out of time, so let's get into the HMV part of this, as we would say, non-invasive ventilation. Now, this is a key point that Ray said earlier that's so important, is that home care, the physician industry, the providers that you go see, that you're getting referrals from, everybody has different terminology these days, right? So we've always called it NIV as kind of a broad term. NIV really could encompass RAD and ventilation. And so, although that's what we've called it as an industry, HMV, this newer term that some people may not have seen before, the idea is to try to separate those two things so that when I say NIV, if I go to Europe and I say NIV, they're going to think BiPAP, right? Whereas here, if I say NIV, they're going to think ventilation. Different parts of the country, it's different, right? And so we all have this different terminology. NIPPV, non-invasive positive pressure ventilation, or HMV is really kind of the category of ventilation, right? So that is ventilator devices and not RAD devices. So we need to all start thinking about how do we look at this and start using that terminology so that we can differentiate the two. Because I think it's important from a payer perspective to make sure we all have the same terminology, we're saying the same things, and we all understand, what we're talking about, and they understand what we're talking about. So the HMV section here is really where it gets a little bit more restrictive from what we have today, because what we have today, as Rhonda pointed out, is very vague and is based on diagnosis and is based on, the coverage criteria as a whole. So if we look at this HMV policy, again, there's two pathways. You can do it directly or coming out of the hospital. So there's kind of two different pathways in this too, which again, I like. But on the HMV side, it's much more restrictive. As Ray mentioned in the beginning, you have to have a CO2 greater than 52. Now, clinically, I understand where that came from. To the point that Ray made, there are some patients who are definitely hypercapnic who are not quite at 52 yet, but I understand where that came from. But that's kind of the hard stop. If you don't meet that one criteria, you don't go any farther on either one of these. So everybody has to have an ABG, CO2 greater than 52, and that is the hard stop, right? But then there's some other things that come into play here that allow you to get somebody on home mechanical ventilation directly and not go through a RAD first. Now, I think that is a good thing to call out, is that there could have been a policy that said you have to go through RAD first and then go to HMV. That would have been so restrictive that it would have been detrimental for patients and the industry. So this is a silver lining in this, is that there is a pathway to go directly to HMV. Now, it is a more restrictive pathway because you got to have CO2 over 52 and you have to have either a high oxygen, home oxygen usage of more than 4 liters or 36%. And then there's a few more pathways there. So there are options, right? But those options are more restrictive than they've ever been. But at least we have a clear path.
Yeah, I think what I would also like to add to that is I think what's, again, really interesting in the RAD section, they specifically call out high intensity ventilation is what you have to be on. Now in the HMV section, right, the very first sentence, at the start of that section, they are talking about this is coverage for an HMV used in a volume targeted mode. So in essence, we're talking VAPs for, lack of a better way of saying that. So this is CMS seem to be saying, here's how you can go straight to HMV with a VAPs mode. They have to meet this criteria. So I'd be curious, Boone and Rhonda, what you think of this. What one potential silver lining out of this, if this stays, and goes into effect is then does that take some of the argument away? We know we've got a couple payers, I won't say their name, but we've got a couple payers that are doing a lot of denials up front on HMV and saying, well, VAPS is a mode you can get in a RAD or a bi-level. So you have to try bi-level or RAD first. If CMS puts out this policy that says, no, if you have a patient that meets this criteria, you can go straight to HMV in a volume targeted mode. I'm wondering if that would take some of the wind out of the sails of the arguments on some of these Medicare Advantage plans that are doing these denials.
Well, you would hope so, right? One would think so. We know these plans outside of traditional Medicare have their own agenda, but we would certainly hope it would help explain that. I know our industry's tried already to do that, but we would certainly hope so.
Well, and from Zach and Ray's perspective, I know you had talked about a study here last year where this discussing the disadvantages to step therapy altogether in this case, but the sooner that you're able to get somebody on therapy, reducing mortality rates. I'm thankful that they jump into a volume targeted mode through the HMV side, just from the patient perspective. That high intensity therapy is more likely than not, it's going to be tough to tolerate for that patient. Especially some of those frail patients. Where I see on the HMV side is we've seen across the industry these blanket statements that are on different orders or progress notes. One that I see becoming a blanket statement is requires the alarm and internal battery piece of this, unfortunately, which we've seen some issues in regarding audits around those blanket statements.
Well, I think to your point, Boone, that you just called out that study Dr. Fraser did, which was a huge retrospective study. And it said if you get somebody on ventilation within the first 7 days of them being diagnosed with chronic respiratory failure, then you see a 46% reduction in mortality. Now, that is a very, very, very strong number. And the way that he did that study, I think it should have been included in this, in my opinion. Obviously, I don't make those rules, but it should have been included because both of his studies were looking at just ventilator patients, home ventilation patients, and not looking at bi-level. And both of them had huge results of reductions in mortality. And they were very large populations, and they used CMS data. So I think that's the key, is that they were looking at CMS's data and showed the reduction in mortality. The challenge, though, is with this guideline, how many patients who get diagnosed with chronic respiratory failure will actually be able to be put on home mechanical ventilation right away. And if that's the case, and his study said within 1 to 7 days, reduction in mortality is 46%. Well, if that's the case, then we're never going to see much of that reduction in mortality. And so, again, is that a disservice to the patients to not put them on therapy early on in the process so that we can control exacerbations, reduce the amount of progression of disease because of less exacerbations. I mean, it's one of those things of now we have some really strong data in the last couple of years, and that data wasn't included in this, and it's probably going to restrict us from ever getting to the point where we can meet what that study told us in most cases because of how restrictive it is to get somebody on therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk real quick, and I know we got to come to an end here, and we're going to come back and talk about this again. But let's talk real quick about the requirement and for continued use on ventilation, because this is new, right? In the past, we have looked at compliance. Most companies that we've partnered with over the years, they're tracking compliance, but we know that there have been some audits where organizations weren't tracking compliance, and that money got clawed back in the last several years. And so compliance has become, we know we have to track it. Nobody knew what the definition was for ventilation because we were just kind of going with the sleep guideline of 4 hours. Some people didn't go with that guideline and said that doesn't make any sense, and went with their own guideline of hey, they got to be consistently improving and using the device consistently, which I think is probably the better way to do it. But now we have this continued use policy for home mechanical ventilation. Now, in my opinion, I think it's going to be a little bit easier to do this for mechanical ventilation because these are patients who likely are progressed a little bit more, need to see the physician more often, and you've got an RT going in the home to see that patient. So coordination of those types of services will be a little bit easier than a RAD patient where we're not going in the home. But let's talk just for a second. Anybody have any thoughts on what that requirement of of follow-up at 6 months and the requirement for home mechanical ventilation looks like, and how does that change the industry or change this policy?
I do. So I look at it from the world I sit in with suppliers as far as making sure that the cash flow, the payments, the billing is continuing. And prior to this proposal, you've always had to prove continued use and need. That goes with any DME item. And they give some examples in the language in that what we call the SDR, but the standard documentation requirements policy. So it's making sure the patient's using it, and that could be from dispensing supplies, do maintenance and servicing, showing compliance, also showing continued need, and that comes from the physician. And that can be as simple as the physician documenting something on the record showing use, or even an annual prescription, right? So it was pretty simple as far as getting that information. Now, whether suppliers did that on a regular basis, I think most of them did and had those policies in place. And however, now having this continued use criteria in the proposal, having that evaluation every 6 months, and you can't continue payment until that happens, that is a concern on our side. So there's going to be a lot of holds, a lot of waiting for the patient. And it's not, I don't think it's so much waiting for that patient to or not so much for the patient going to the doctor's office, it's the patient getting in on that timely basis, right? Because it's restricted to every 180 days versus just within, we've seen in the past within a certain amount of days, like within the 61st to 91st day, they have to be reevaluated. Now it's every 180 days. So that I see as a concern for suppliers on the billing side of it that will hold up payment.
I think what I picked up when I read it, and it took 2 or 3 read-throughs to kind of pick up on this, for at least for me, is when you look at the RAD continuing coverage criteria, there's very specific criteria to meet to continue the coverage. You have to document the CO2 reduction, or reduction in exacerbations that lead to hospitalizations, or a reduction in symptoms. Very specific. When you look for the HMV, it's a little more vague, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It really just talks about that, to your point, Rhonda, by day 180, they have to see the doctor, and the doctor is, establishing that continued coverage is medically necessary. There's not a bunch of testing that, at least right now, that's being required to validate that. The doctor just needs to see the patient, see that they're using the device, and then attest that it is medically necessary they continue to use it. So it almost, at least at initial high-level read, looks like maybe a little easier to continue the coverage on the H&D side than on the RAD, but at least there's not as many specific steps. But I agree with you. At the end of the day, they have to get back into that doc at a regular basis, and that's going to create some pain points.
Yeah.
The only thing I wanted to put out there, and I'd be curious what you think of this, Ron. Again, I didn't pick on this one until a couple read-throughs, is that word consistent use for at least 5 hours per day that's in the RAD is not spelled out in the HMV. That word consistent use is gone. They say the HMV has been used for an average of at least 5 hours per 24-hour period. So yeah. I'd like to see, can we get consistent use brought in,
right.
For HMV? Because there seems to be no wiggle room with HMV, with that.
And you're so right on, yeah. And that is something we would add in a comment, right? To say we need that consistent in there. Valid point. Yeah, I didn't even catch on that until you said it. I was reading. I'm like, you're right. It doesn't say consistent in there. It says average. Interesting.
Yeah. That's a little troubling in the way it's currently written. So it'd be nice if they were consistent with the use of the word consistent and have it in both. So.
And the concern I have with seeing the practitioner, they say a reevaluation with the practitioner. Currently, at least through the end of September, we have the flexibilities with telehealth, right? So that is allowed for these patients as well to do a telehealth visit. If that doesn't get changed in the language to have these flexibilities incorporated into the telehealth language, and let's say that just goes away, so you're back to the original telehealth requirements, this is a problem too, because you either have to have an originating site for telehealth or you now have to go in and see the doctor. Right. So that's a concern with all of this. And telehealth is helpful for patients once they're established is because of all the data that we can do from remote, right? So, and to the point of, let's do the trans-Q, right? Like monitoring with the CO2, levels at home.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I think that average of 5 hours could put some serious restrictions on what we're doing. The other part in the the section of going home from the hospital that I think could be very, very restrictive in this policy is that it says within 24 hours of discharge. We talked about this before on the RAD side, but you have to be on the same device or similar device, similar therapy. And so that means that if a patient is on a hospital grade BiPAP, which is essentially more powerful than a home mechanical ventilation device in a lot of cases. But if they're on a BiPAP in the hospital, then can they even go home on home mechanical ventilation? Because it says it has to be the same type of device. So if that's the case, how many hospitals actually use? I mean, nobody uses home mechanical ventilation, or maybe not many. I know that React and some of the manufacturers are now going into the hospitals and selling their products as bi-level devices because of some of the shortage issues and recall issues. But how many people are actually using home mechanical ventilation or real ventilation on a ventilator versus a BiPAP device? But as we all know, BiPAP in the hospital is not equal to a BiPAP in the home. But if that terminology, the way I read that could become very, very restrictive. And hospitals would have to change the way they manage patients to ever get anybody approved to go home on ventilation. And there's a lot of room for interpretation in the way that reads.
Totally agree. Totally agree with that.
So one last call out, and I know we got to end this. We could talk about it all day, but there's a mask section under H&V. And we've never had that before. Are they saying they're going to cover resupply on certain patients under H&V potentially? Because it makes a call out, but it doesn't say what that looks like, or, it says certain types of patients, but when can you do it? How can you do it? Is there going to be coverage for resupply for the first time ever for home ventilation? And do you think this part will stick?
An interesting piece of this policy, it reads specifically that they're proposing to cover for daytime use, if I'm not mistaken, for those patients that are requiring use for greater than 8 hours in that 24-hour period. So either covering MPV or mouthpiece ventilation or a nasal mask for use during day hours. It's interesting that they called out specifically a nasal mask because some of these patients may not tolerate a nasal mask with therapy, right? If they're using a full face at night, they may be possibly using a full face during the day as well. Interesting concept, I guess. From my perspective, that they may cover it. They're thinking about covering either that MPV, or it's what I get hung up in is the specificity of the nasal mask piece of it.
And this is obviously another area that the waters are a little muddy with it, right? Because we know ventilators belong to the payment category of frequent and substantial servicing, which includes all the supplies with it, right? All the repairs, all the maintenance, it includes everything. So if this is going to happen, they need to be, I think, more specific in this area so that it doesn't get misinterpreted, because it will easily, right? Because we can all sit here, all four of us, and have 4 different concepts for it, right? And that can cause some trouble for suppliers. So while I think it's a good thing if they're considering what we are thinking, but they would need to be more specific because of what the payment category says for ventilators. So
it's interesting that they're honing in on the mask piece of this, and not even necessarily the more expensive piece being that home humidifier that a majority of these patients are utilizing as well. So if we're pulling that mask piece out of it, will they propose pulling out that humidifier piece as well?
Well, I think, like we said, we could talk about this all day, and there's a lot to still break down and decipher. But the closing thought for me is we really need the industry to be engaged in this, right? It would be easy to sit on our hands and miss the opportunity. There's only 20 more days to make comments. And if we don't make comments, I've always said, if you are not at the table, then you're on the menu. And in this case, that definitely applies, that we got to be at the table making comments. That's our play right now. We would love for this to get rescinded and redone because it's so vague and there's a lot of things that need to be cleared up. But if that doesn't happen, then our comments are the best chance we have of making changes to make this more clear. So I can't say that enough, that we need to make comments and we need to have a combined effort in the industry of what are those comments that need to be put out. We're going to all be putting out more content about that. So make sure you're following VGM, make sure you're following us, so that as we put out these things, we can come together from a combined front. And Rhonda, question that I hear all the time: if a supplier makes a comment to CMS, could they use that against them, or could they get in trouble, or is anybody going to get mad at them, or are these comments totally separate from anything they're doing from a provider standpoint?
Thank you for bringing that up, because we do hear that all the time too, where suppliers are hesitant to tie their name to anything related really to CMS, and they're afraid they're going to get an X on their back, that target. That's not how it works. It would be, I mean, if a supplier doesn't comment that offers these ventilators and RADs, and they don't comment, and this gets released and then they're complaining about it, well, you can't complain about it because you didn't comment. You have to be engaged in this policy, because if it does come to fruition where it is a final policy, to me, it's almost a little scary of what this is going to look like. As I dove deep into it this week with other suppliers and talking to you guys at Encore and others within VGM, there's some concerning things in there. And we don't want this finalized, because to go back in and get it reopened would take years. So let's not go that route. Let's stay ahead of the game. In talking to some suppliers and other industry stakeholders this week, because of how the policy's written, and as we digested it a little bit more, there is, the industry's talking about having a push to have this rescinded. And the reasons being, with the concerns of it, looking at it's more of an acute policy versus post-acute. There's some old studies in there. Some suppliers have felt like it was just kind of put together to meet a deadline. So there is that push to get it rescinded and relooked at. VGM is here to support what the industry wants. We won't make our own comments ourselves. We will be here for the industry, and that's how we'll comment. So what we'll have is our comments available for suppliers that aren't sure how to do that, because it can be a little bit scary, in all honesty, to put together comments, because your name's tied to it. But we'll have our comments together based off what the industry wants. It'll be in a Word doc. So if you want that, when it gets closer to the deadline and we have that ready, we'll share it. It'll be available, and you can edit as you need to submit the comments. But we're here to help with that part of it. I know I've been involved in meetings, and others at VGM will be involved as well. And Encore, we're going to get you guys involved too, because we need the industry to speak up loudly on this.
Well, and from our perspective, when we release the podcast and more information, we'll continue to include where you can make comments. And again, like Rhonda said, from Rhonda's perspective and the VGM government relations side, if you're not sure what to comment, we'll have some ideas there for you as well.
Yeah, and I would just echo what everyone said. Take the time to read the document. The first, again, it's 50 plus pages, but it's the first 4 or 5 that are the actual proposal. Take the time to read those first 4 or 5 pages. Be on the lookout for what the VGM or AA Home Care is going to put out. Take time to read that. To Zach's point, we've got about 20 days where you can make some comments. This is one of the advantages of being a VGM member, right? Is you've got access to these individuals and these teams. So definitely utilize that opportunity.
For sure. And if anybody listening to this has questions or just anything about this that they want to talk about, reach out to any of us. We'd be more than happy to digest any of this with you or help guide you through it, because it is the way they lay this out. It seems like it's a lot of information, and there is, but like Ray and others have said, it's just the first few pages that you need to really look at. So, but reach out to any of us, and we'll make sure that the link to that CMS website is included here, so you guys can easily click on it and take a look at it.
All right. Well, we'll continue this conversation here a little bit later date. Zach, Ray, Rhonda.
Yeah.
Thanks as always. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Yeah, for sure.